the Chief of Interpretation, Education, and Visitor Services here at Cuyahoga Valley National Park. And I've also been the Parks Project Manager for this planning project. Last year, we came out to the public with a draft of a community access plan, which was looking broadly at all the ways that we could improve the visitor experience in the park while protecting natural and cultural resources. What we are doing now is coming to you with a draft of the environmental assessment for select actions out of that plan. This is really the first step in implementation, and our goal is to really orient you to this environmental assessment to prepare you to comment. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Next slide, please. Again, I introduce myself. Also with us today is Pam Barnes from Cuyahoga Valley National Park. She's the Community Engagement Supervisor and Public Information Officer. We've been working with Denver Service Center on this project. Denver Service Center is an office of the National Park Service based in Colorado that is focused on planning, design, and construction. They've been really instrumental in leading this process. We have Rose, Maureen, and Kelsey from that team who've been really great and wonderful guides all along the way. Next slide, please. So what we're doing today is a quick introduction to the park, to the planning process, to the plan itself, and then again, we'll describe what is in this particular action, and we'll go through an overview of what we analyzed so that you can understand and build upon our analysis through your commenting process. And of course, your critical role. We always do things better when we get the viewpoints of the community. So we're really glad you're here today. Next slide. All right, I'm turning it over to you, Maureen.
Yeah, thanks. Just before we get too far down this road, we want to make sure that everybody's comfortable using the Teams platform. You know, over the last couple of years, we've all been in a variety of online meetings using a variety of platforms. So Microsoft Teams just has a few tools that y'all might want to be aware of. If you're curious to see who is on the call with us today, you can up on the top of your screen, you can look at that people button that'll show you who's on the call today. The chat feature is that little speech bubble. We do encourage y'all to use the chat feature throughout the presentation. You can put questions in there, comments, particularly during the question and answer session at the end of the presentation. Please feel free to use that chat feature. Also during that Q&A session, there's that little hand raise feature, picture of the hand, that will also alert us that you want to jump in and participate in the conversation during the Q&A session. I'll talk about these additional controls in just a moment. If you're having bandwidth issues, that video on off button is helpful. You can turn your video on and off using that. And then right next to it is the audio on off button. We are going to ask that folks stay muted during the presentation, and then during the question and answer session, please feel free to unmute yourself and participate in that part of the discussion. I mentioned, I talk about some additional controls here, that 3 buttons, just a couple things to be aware of there. There are live captions available through Microsoft Teams. We do also have a professional captioning service available today. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. And then again, that turn off incoming video button is there as well. Okay, I mentioned captioning services for today's call. If you're interested in taking advantage of this service, Kelsey dropped the link in the chat. This is provided by Birnbaum Interpreting Services for us today. So please feel free to click on that link and take advantage of the captioning service if it is helpful for you. All right, with that, we are going to start today's conversation with an introduction to the park itself, and then we'll talk more about the content of the environmental assessment. So Pam is going to start us off with the introduction to the park.
Thanks, Maureen.
So I just want to start with that kind of 30,000-foot overview of the park, just to put all of this into context. And there were that little green blob there in Northeast Ohio. So you can see it in the context of right next to the Great Lakes, the largest system of fresh water in the world. The Cuyahoga River runs through the center of the park, and we're smack in between the major cities of Cleveland and Akron. Next slide, please. So as we zoom in a bit more, you can see that outline of the national park, the green representing those boundaries that were outlined when the park was established in 1974. So that 33,000 acres that we encompass doesn't mean that we own all of those 33,000 acres. We are in and amongst and next to a lot of different communities. So with that context, it just means that we can't operate without getting the input and working alongside communities. So we just want to echo that we really appreciate that you're here today. So when our park was established, it outlined a purpose for us. On the next slide, please, it outlines what our purpose is. And this is in our enabling legislation. So we are supposed to preserve and protect for the public the historic, scenic, natural, and recreational values of the Cuyahoga River and its valley. And then we're also supposed to maintain the recreational open space necessary for those in the urban environment. And we're also charged with providing for the recreational and educational needs of the public. So it's this dual purpose of protecting and providing access, which is what this plan is all about. The next slide, please. So as a unit of the national park system, so we have what they call fundamental resources and values. It's what is it that is about this park that makes it significant, and what's just fundamental about it. So it's the Cuyahoga River, it's the surrounding forest ecosystems, the canal, the historic railway, the agricultural resources, and the history of the rural landscape in the valley, the Virginia Kendall State Park Historic District, and again, this transportation network on the trail, the water, and the rail. And there are two things that were called out in our resources and values that have to do with the way that we engage with the public. And that's through place-based education and engaging with the community. Next slide, please. Another thing about a national park is that it has to have something about it that is nationally significant. So these significant statements outline how any unit of the national park represents national significance. So on our list of national significance is the ecological integrity of this valley, how it's a crossroads between the Appalachian Highlands and the Midwest and the Great Lakes, and so the divide between the Great Lakes watershed and the Mississippi watershed. It's a great story of how a degraded landscape has been restored. We preserve that story of transportation, cultural resources, and we share the stewardship as we are continuing to restore the valley. And also named in that park significance is the innovation in education and recreation. We were established as a recreation area, and then we changed our name to National Park in the year 2000. So with that little bit of a context setting, I'm going to turn it back over to Jenny now, who will talk a bit more, I guess, Maureen, about the planning process.
Yeah, thanks so much, Pam. So as I mentioned earlier, we've been involved in this planning process for over 2 years now. We started with part one, as you see on the screen, developing the community access plan. That community access plan is a comprehensive visitor use plan that looks at a number of issues and opportunities that were established throughout the planning process. That document was released for public comment last summer. We got lots of great comments on that document, which really helped shape this environmental assessment and what we were going to pull, part of what we were going to pull forward in part 2, which is where we are now, which is the circulation environmental assessment. So as Jenny mentioned earlier, that is a piece of what was prioritized, what was feasible to implement in the near term, and also what we had information to really do a meaningful analysis on. So those were kind of the criteria that we used to decide what was going to be pulled forward during this environmental assessment process. So that's where we are right now. That's the document that we're asking for y'all to dig into with us. And then following on the heels of this environmental assessment process, we'll have a decision document, which is the document of kind of that document of record, which finalizes our planning process at that point. So as part of this planning process, we are using the Interagency Visitor Use Management Framework. This is a framework that was developed over 10 years ago by 6 federal land management agencies to standardize visitor use management planning across all of our federal agencies. And so this has been our guidance throughout the entire planning process. And we've worked through this process from start to finish as part of the community access plan and now the environmental assessment. So I mentioned, again, we started this as the community access plan. That plan was really, as I said, a comprehensive plan to address the following things, this adapting to changing park visitation. Oops, excuse me. Wrong slide. Adapting to changing park visitation, providing inclusive and equitable visitor access, addressing congestion and visitor use conflicts. We want to make sure people can find their way around. So addressing that wayfinding, visitor circulation. We want to provide good visitor information. Addressing those impacts to natural and cultural resources, and planning for river access and camping. So if you go back and you look at the community access plan, which is available, we'll show you where that is towards the end of the presentation. But if you go back in and look at that plan, you'll see all of these things addressed in the community access plan in one way or another. This environmental assessment has a slightly narrower purpose. So the purpose of the circulation environmental assessment is really to alleviate congestion at those high priority locations while preserving natural and cultural resources in the park. So the need behind this environmental assessment is really tied to a number of things. One, there's a mismatch between the availability of parking and the demand for parking. Some of you may have experienced this on a busy weekend in the park. So we wanted to make sure that we're looking at right sizing the parking. We also know that there are times when visitors are unable to access key destinations in the park, and that can be anywhere from popular waterfalls to the visitor center, right? There's times where folks just cannot access that because of a number of reasons, mostly parking and congestion. We know that through high levels of visitor use, we can often see vegetation and soil trampling and compaction, particularly along the social trails. We wanted to address that need. Because of that kind of disconnect between availability of parking and the need for parking, we see vehicles parked informally on roadways, and that can impact our historic view sheds, historic resources. And then the last piece was really to address the towpath. Right now, the towpath trail surface types are inconsistent. There's a mixture of crushed limestone and pavement. And there's also locations where it's very difficult to maintain. So those were the real reasons that we embarked on this EA process to address those primary issues that came out of the community access planning. In order to address that, we came up with a proposed action, and Jenny is going to give you all a little bit more detail on what is included in that proposed action.
Thank you, Maureen. Let's go to the next slide. Just a few more kind of broad pieces before we get into the specifics. You know, we had some key kind of vision that we are trying to achieve through this work. One is that visitors find recreational opportunities that fit a wide range of interest, ages, skill levels, and abilities. Accessibility is prioritized. You'll definitely see that in the proposed action. That we're focused on maintaining the integrity of both specific cultural resources and the cultural landscape, which is kind of how the cultural resources exist on the landscape and interact with each other. Park interpretation includes stories that reflect the diverse and complex history of the valley. We're protecting sensitive natural resources, restoring degraded resources, and really focusing on the overall health of the Cuyahoga River watershed. And then finally, that facility development really fits within the landscape and creates a welcoming environment. So that's our broad direction, the broad vision we're trying to achieve. Next slide. In the process of doing an environmental assessment, there are a number of impact topics, which are really what are those resources that our actions are most likely to impact. And, you know, the first step is to go through all the different types of resources and select those that are most relevant to the particular set of things we're proposing to do. So the impact topics that we're focused on are archaeological resources, cultural landscapes, historic structure, soils, vegetation, and then visitor use and experience. If you want to know which ones we considered but decided that didn't need further analysis, they're all described in the environmental assessment, so that is available for you to review. Next slide. So then we get to the specific actions and alternatives. We have two alternatives. One is the no action alternative. This is very typical environmental assessment language, which is tied to the National Environmental Policy Act. And basically the no action alternative means we're going to keep things as they are now. So we have something to compare change to. Action B on the next slide is our preferred alternative. And it is a suite of actions. Some environmental assessments have multiple alternatives that are considered. We're just considering A and B. So what I'm going to do now is walk through the very specific actions that are included in this plan, this environmental assessment. It is not everything in the community access plan. It is those things that are more likely to happen in the next 5 years, and that we have enough information to do an environmental assessment on. Some things that are in the plan, and we've already done environmental assessment, so there might be some things that you saw in the cap that you would consider high priority and wonder why they're not here. Well, some we've already done the work. Some things don't require an environmental assessment. So you know, I think that's one thing to look at. And if there were things that you thought we should have been doing an environmental including in here, I'd be curious to hear what those are. So anyway, what I'm going to do now is just highlight what's in there and then highlight some key findings in our analysis. I'm going to be sharing kind of a lot of information, and really I consider what I'm trying to do is orienting you to the plan so that you can go read it a little more slowly and at your leisure, but at least, you know, through what we're sharing now, you know what is in the plan. So the first action in there was actually, it's more a Cleveland Metro Parks and Summit Metro Parks project, but a part of it occurs on Park Service land. It's also a very high priority trail in the Cuyahoga County Trail and Greenway Plan, and that is a multi-use Sagamore Creek connector trail which would go from Canal Road to the hike and bike trail in the northern section of the park. It really connects the park into Bedford Reservation with the bicycle trail a little bit more directly. That's the purpose of that action. The next one was probably the one that was most controversial in the public review of the community access plan. And again, doing the analysis, the environmental analysis, helps us understand this even more to help us get to a decision whether or not to do this. And that is to change the surface treatment of the towpath trail within Cuyahoga Valley National Park to chip sealed asphalt. I'm going to give a little bit of background here. Our maintenance staff has been asking us to consider this change because the current surface is a mix of asphalt and crushed limestone. We're having a hard time keeping up with maintenance. Our maintenance staff has made a good case that chip sealed asphalt is easier for them to keep up on maintenance. So what we wanted to know, because it's a historic resource, what are historically appropriate choices? So the Ohio and Erie Canal Cultural Landscape Report is something that we completed to ask the question, what's historically appropriate? That showed that the current treatment of crushed limestone is fine. Chip sealed asphalt is an alternative. What that plan really asked us to do is to pick one and use it the whole length of the trail. Right now we have primarily the crushed limestone, but we use asphalt in places, and they think that being consistent is really important. So we're analyzing that one. The rest are organized by location. In the area of Everett Covered Bridge, we are proposing expanding parking, not by expanding the current lot, but by adding a second lot in the vicinity of Everett Road and Wheatley Road, where some road removal has just taken place. We had looked at expanding the existing lot. Actually, the preliminary analysis told us that it would impact sensitive cultural resources, so we eliminated that action. Next slide. We do have a suite of removing existing underutilized parking spots. We're proposing removing 20 spots at Kendall Lake, closest to the wetland parts, wetland area adjacent to the lake. It would allow for some wetland protection, and then to fully remove Little Meadow and Crowfoot Gully trailhead. We have 3 large parking areas in the Kendall Hills. We would remove 2 of them. Next slide. At the Kendall ledges themselves, we would make improvements to create accessible trails. Right now, there's very limited ADA accessibility at the ledges. You can get to the shelters, but not really to the natural resources of the ledges. So we're proposing an accessible trail across the playfield to the ledges overlook. It would include some boardwalking so people could get up and see the view. And then something similar to the ledges above Icebox Cave. Next slide. So fairly light touch, but would have potential impacts. Brandywine Falls, we definitely have parking issues there. What we were able to pull forward at this time, where we had enough information, was to convert 10 spaces in the lot to kind of short-term parking, meaning that people could be there for 30 minutes, an hour, so that there would be a higher turnover and fewer visitors would be turned away. Next slide. And we're also proposing to do the same thing at Boston Mill Visitor Center parking, where, so that there's some parking really tied to the visitor center that wouldn't get used by people who are parking there for a longer recreational visit, a hike or a bicycle ride. Next slide. The Stanford Hines Hill area, it also includes the East Rim Trail System, and what we are proposing for that area is to formalize the gravel lot that we currently have there for East Rim Trail, which would we would formalize it, and in doing so, it would expand the number of spots there. We would add a vault toilet, and then if needed, there is a former residential site that we call the Lorenz property that we could add additional parking as well. Next slide. Another parking removal at the south end of the park would be to reduce the size of the Boatsum Trailhead. That is the southernmost trailhead in the national park for the towpath trail. There's also a train boarding station at the location. It's a shared trailhead with Summit Metro Parks. Next slide. In the Furnace Run area, which is really the trail system associated with Everett Covered Bridge, the road removal that has taken place there has disrupted the ability to do an independent loop experience on Riding Run Trail. We would install a pedestrian and horse bridge to reestablish that loop trail through this section. Next slide. At Blue Hen Falls, there's a suite of actions up there. We would reestablish parking up at the top by Blue Hen Falls, but specifically for limited mobility and ADA parking. We would provide an ADA trail to the waterfall. We would formalize a trailhead for the rest of the people heading to Blue Hen Falls down in the Boston area with improved permanent signage. And then as an option, if it proved necessary, we would use managed access for that limited mobility parking, meaning some kind of reservation system if there was too much demand for it. What we're not proposing to do is reestablish all the parking we had up at Blue Hen Falls, but just parking for people with limited mobility. Next slide. Okay, so those are the actions. Again, I know it's a lot to understand, but I wanted you to see what was in there and, kind of pay attention to what might be of particular interest to you. So likewise, I'm going to run through our impact topics and how we're seeing them. This is really, again, an orientation, and hopefully you'll know where you'd like to take a deeper dive. In terms of archaeological resources, we know that any ground disturbance could damage or destroy both known and unknown archaeological resources and their context. Where we don't have existing surveys, we would do new surveys to precede any construction activity. So based on that, we would know areas to avoid and feel like adverse impacts on archaeological resources would be limited. Next slide. I'm going to move to cultural landscapes. Cultural landscapes and historic structures are somewhat similar, so the next two conversations will feel a bit overlapping. But the changes that we're proposing in the Virginia Kendall area are part of the Virginia Kendall State Park National Historic District. So it's a site on the National Register. There would be potential adverse impacts by removing a piece of the Virginia Kendall parking lot. We know that lot was constructed by the Civilian Conservation Corps. We're not certain that the other two lots, Crowfoot Gully and Little Meadow, were part of the district as contributing structures. We would need to confirm that with some additional research. Adding new features to the Ledges Trail also could have a potential impact on both the cultural landscape and the historic structures of that district. We do think it is positive for the cultural landscape to do a consistent, historically appropriate treatment for the towpath trail. Again, we have two choices. We're going towards not crushed limestone, but the asphalt with a crushed limestone chip seal. So we think that would be an improvement from a historic perspective. And then there was one other action that didn't make it onto the list. It's a small action to remove some roadside parking in the near the historic Hunt Wilkie Farm in the vicinity of Zalays. Removing that would actually reestablish the rural character because right now vehicles intrude upon that. Next slide. Historic structures. I'm not going to repeat the Virginia Kendall actions, but I did want to highlight that we recognize that using heavy machinery as we repair the towpath trail or resurface the towpath trail could have inadvertent adverse impacts due to compression, slumping, or gouging. Of course, the beneficial impact is the consistent treatment with historic character. Next slide. Soils, any construction of new trails and parking lots involve both vegetation clearing and soil disturbance. Soils and vegetation have some overlap, just like the cultural landscape and historic does. Developing and expanding parking lots can cause soil compaction and reduce soil productivity. But on the flip side, removing parking would have beneficial impacts to soil. If we completely followed through on this plan, we would gain 2 to 3 acres going out of parking. We would be taking out more parking than we're putting in. Again, if we fully implement this plan, which of course, going through this analysis is part of that decision-making process. And then, trails do have impact on both vegetation and soils by compaction, especially when people kind of go off trail, avoiding puddles and that kind of thing. The impacts to vegetation are very parallel to the impacts to soil. Can almost replace the word. We would be impacting about an acre of vegetation through new trails, and new and expanded parking could impact up to 2 acres. At the same time, we would be bringing parking back to native vegetation. So there's trade-offs there in trying to right-size parking. Next slide. The last impact topic is visitor use and experience, and it's got the most points to it. When we add new trails, we're adding new recreational opportunities and increasing connectivity and the ability to circulate within the park. So that's an advantage of the Sagamore Connector Trail, the Trail Bridge on Furnace Run, and some of the other trail activities. Chip sealed asphalt is a real trade-off. Improved maintenance would certainly benefit the visitor experience. There are certainly some user groups that chip sealed asphalt really appeals to. There are other user groups that chip sealed asphalt does not appeal to, and they would be inconvenienced or displaced by the change in surface type. So definitely trade-offs in that decision. Expanding parking certainly creates benefit to visitor experience by improving access to trails. This particular parking expansion would benefit people in general, but also specifically people with horses, because we would plan for some horse trailer parking. Next slide. Removing parking has both pluses and minuses from a visitor use perspective. One is it's hard to anticipate future need for that parking. So it might lead to congestion problems later. We do know that these lots are underutilized right now. And when people go there, by feeling underutilized, they feel a little isolated and uncomfortable. So more appropriately scaled parking is actually more comfortable to visitors from a safety perspective. And then our accessibility actions, of course, improve access to the park, especially with visitors with disabilities. On the flip side, people looking for a less developed experience that might impact their visitor experience negatively. Next slide. And then the time-limited parking would benefit people looking for a short visit. In like any kind of change, it would potentially displace some users looking for longer-term parking. Next slide. Oh, there's more. So improving parking at East Rim, more spots, adding a vault toilet is also advantageous just for human waste disposal and convenience for visitors having a nice restroom there. And then improving circulation on Riding Run Trail kind of restores circulation that was impacted by the changes with the road removal. And then the suite of actions at Blue Hen Falls would provide beneficial impacts to the visitor experience, especially for people with limited mobility, who we've heard extensively from through the CAP process. Next slide. So I'm going to hand it over, but I just wanted to say one last thing. This is our analysis. We're very, very interested on your point of view to help us really think more broadly. Multiple perspectives really helps with great decision making. So glad you're here and interested, and I'm going to turn it over for more explanation on how to get involved.
Great. Thanks, Jenny. And there are some great questions in the chat about this too. So we'll just describe how to use Pepsi and how to provide formal comment. So we can go to the next slide. We are also going to drop in links for how to navigate to Pepsi. So you'll have everything right here. What Jenny just articulated is the piece we're most interested in. Have we considered and articulated all of the potential environmental impacts of the actions in this plan? So you have comments or you think we missed something in the analysis. We're very interested in hearing your thoughts and suggestions. Next slide. So the Pepsi is going to be open through July 11th, and we have, yeah, there you go, in the chat. It'll be July 11th. There's the link to as well. We had folks on our previous meeting today ask, if they have more detailed comments, is there some other way to submit them? And yes, of course, you can mail them in, and we can also upload those to Pepsi on our end. So that's the link. We can go to the next slide and we'll just talk you through how to navigate because it can be a little bit confusing. So once you click that link, then on the left-hand column, you'll want to click the open for comment. That will then bring you to the page where you can click on the Cuyahoga Valley National Park Circulation Environmental Assessment, Summer 2023 Public Scoping. And then you'll get to the place where there's the comment box that says comment now, and that'll give you the pop out where you can put in your comments. You click on the PDF that you're wanting to comment on and add information, add your comments there. You can be as detailed and as specific as you would like. The more specific, the easier it is for us to incorporate your comments into some conversations with the park team and updates as needed. And so then that link is in the chat and you have now through July 11th, and we are very interested in all of your comments and suggestions. I think with that, what we'll do is I'll turn things over to Kelsey and open it up for some questions and answers. Oh, we also have the story map. Sorry, that's going to be the next slide. Sorry, Maureen, I was jumping ahead. So the story map is another place where you can see a visual representation of the content in the EA. So when you click on the link to the story map, you'll get to the collections page. And in the collections page, you'll see two links. There will be a link to the environmental assessment. That's what we're commenting on now. And we mentioned earlier the community access plan, which the environmental assessment is analyzing actions from the community access plan. So when you open that, it's just a really nice way to break down some of the information. So that's another place where you can see the purpose, the overview, the need for the assessment, impact topics, and you can click around in there as well.